Hello and welcome to another episode of my Nazi series podcast, Legacy and Lessons. I'm here with Michael again. Michael, how are you?
Good morning. I guess for you it would be afternoon.
It is the afternoon here, so good morning to you.
Thank you. How are things with you?
Good, yeah. I don't know if enjoyed is the word, but I found it incredibly interesting doing my research for this podcast. I don't know, we're doing the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial today. Was this something that you knew a lot about before you started doing your research?
Wouldn't say that I knew a lot about it. I read a couple of books on it. It's been probably 15 years. I did a review for Holocaust and Genocide Studies of a book by Devin Pendis, I think it was, on the Auschwitz trial. That was back in 2005 or 6, shortly
Yeah,
after the book came out. And of course, I mean, you can't, if you do any sort of work in this field, you can't avoid the Auschwitz trial. But I can't say that I was an authority on the topic. It was helpful to brush up on it, and in particular to try to integrate this trial into the stream of post-war efforts to reckon with the legacy of Nazi crimes and Nazi genocide in particular. So I found that to be enormously helpful, especially in view of our discussion a couple of weeks ago of the
yeah.
Ulm Einsatzgruppen trial, with which the Auschwitz trial, of course, is very closely linked.
Yeah, there's so much information on this because it was all recorded on tape and then it's been transcribed. So you've essentially got everything that was said in court for 2 years. If you wish to go and look at that, so you've got all, like, you could fill basically a library with what there is on this because there's thousands and thousands of pages. So I was in my element. I was just dipping in. I was going in to listen to what the defense counsel was saying. Rudolf Werber is on the stand, who we're going to talk about later, one of the most famous survivors of Auschwitz. So I went in and listened to what he said in court, and I was jumping into what different people were saying, prosecution, defense, different witnesses, and it was all just fascinating. And I was never reading it and thinking, oh, this is dry. It was all just like fascinating and gripping and horrifying and
Really gripping, yeah. Of course, this wasn't the first. The first
yeah,
Auschwitz trial was the first, I guess, the first German kind of mass trial of Auschwitz defendants. But as we know, there were earlier Auschwitz trials.
I think it's important before we go on to the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial that we actually talk about one in particular, but maybe some of the others. Well, first of all, Rudolf Hoss is probably the first major trial to mention because he was the commandant of Auschwitz for the majority of the time of Auschwitz's existence. And I suppose you could say he's got most blood on his hands. The murder of Hungary's Jews in Auschwitz was named Operation Hoss, the murder of about 370,000 people in about 56 days. And he was tried quite early on, and he was handed over to Poland's Supreme National Tribunal, wasn't he?
Right, under the terms of the Moscow Declaration, right? He actually testified at Nuremberg, and I think he offered testimony on Kaltenbrunner, who was Heydrich's successor as the head of the Reich Security Main Office. And Kaltenbrunner's counsel, I think it was Kaltenbrunner, who called Hearst to the stand. And of course, Hearst then proceeded to offer testimony that was very damaging to Kaltenbrunner. But nonetheless, he was in Nuremberg for a time, and then under the terms of the Moscow Declaration, he was sent back. He was extradited to Poland, where he stood trial. I think he was tried in Warsaw by the Supreme National Tribunal and convicted of murder, genocide, crimes against humanity, you name it. They threw the kitchen sink at him, membership in a criminal organization. And quite famously or infamously, he was then hanged on a makeshift gallows, which continues to stand to the present day. Last time I was in the camp, I took a photograph of it and included that in my book, Nazi Crimes and Their Punishment.
Yep.
He was hanged right around the corner from his house,
Yep.
which of course was featured in the film that was made about Hearst. Came out last year. It was a German film, Zone of Silence, I think it
Zone
is.
of interest.
No, Zone of Interest. That's it. Zone of
Yeah.
Interest. Yeah, and
Yeah,
yeah,
you can see I was there just about 10 days ago. You can see his residence from where the gallows is, and that was the last. It was public, but I don't think that just the general public were allowed to go. I think there were select people that were allowed to go and witness this, but it was the last public hanging in Poland ever. And I thought that was quite interesting because imagine how long public hangings have been going on in Poland for, probably hundreds and hundreds of years, and then the last one was Rudolf Hoss, and
so,
obviously more hangings went on afterwards. But that was the last public one, and I think quite fitting. Whatever you think of the death penalty and people being hung, I don't think there's a more deserving person
yeah,
to be hung. And it was symbolic, obviously. It has symbolic meaning, the fact that he was taken back there when he lived this cushy life in this villa with his kids and his wife, and they were dipping into the things that were being stolen from the victims. And he had this incredibly high status job, and people were treating with the utmost respect, and he was living a luxury existence. And then the last time he was on that premises or near them was in very different circumstances because he had his life taken.
yeah, and even though I'm an opponent of capital punishment per se, I kind of waver a little bit on this issue, right?
Mm,
Perhaps there are some crimes that are so egregious, so um, so offensive to the moral order and the relations between human beings that they call for capital punishment. I'm still an opponent of it, but I can't say that I shed a lot of tears for Rudolf Hoss in particular.
no, there's only so many tears that you've got, isn't there? So I'm not going to waste them on him.
Lemon supply.
Yeah, yeah.
Allocate your tears carefully.
He ain't getting any. And then after Huss, there was the another Auschwitz trial of 40. I think they were second, third tier
Yeah,
Auschwitz personnel. It's interesting to state that throughout Auschwitz's existence, it's thought that between 7 to 8,000 people worked there at one point or another, and they'd either get transferred to other camps, and only a minuscule amount of them were ever tried.
it's true.
But there's Hus, and then there was 40 others who, famously, Maria Mandel, one of the female perpetrators of the Holocaust, was tried during this. I think she was one of the first people to be executed, and a few other quite high-profile people that are not household names but are well known in Holocaust studies were tried.
Right.
And as with Hus, this trial was using the legislation that was being used to try these people was very different to the trials that we've been focusing on, like the Ulm trial and then the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial that we'll focus on later, because they're using the same kind of legislation as the Allies were, right? With saying that this was crimes against humanity and war crimes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the actual legal basis was not the charter, though. Right? We talked about the London Charter a little bit last in our last discussion together. Right, the London Charter was the legal basis to the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg.
Mm,
That was, of course, not the legal basis to the Polish trials, but in front of the Supreme National Tribunal. That was based on a decree in I think August 31st, 1944, as the Red Army was driving driving the Germans out of Poland. The successor government then passes this law, and then it's revised in 1946 to bring it more into um, alignment I think, with the findings of Nuremberg. Don't forget that Nuremberg is going on at the same time as more or less at the same time as the Supreme National Tribunal is hearing its cases.
Mm.
And so the court in Poland is consciously trying to incorporate the findings from the International Military Tribunal into its own prosecutions of Nazi war criminals. And you see that very, very vividly, I think, and strikingly in the case of the criminal organizations charge. Remember, this is one of the primary charges against the Nazis. It's often overlooked when people think of
Mm.
the crimes of the Nazis tried at Nuremberg. They probably don't think of membership in a criminal organization, but that was a really important charge that was added to the war crimes and crimes against humanity, crimes against peace. It was conspiracy, and then this criminal organizations charge. So the Poles amended their decree of August 31st, 1944 in 1946 to take into account the IMT's findings concerning criminal organizations, right? And so there were 4 organizations within the Nazi state that were deemed to be criminal. They were, if I can remember them correctly now off the top of my head, and the Gestapo, the SS, the SD, the Security Service, and the leadership core of the Nazi Party. Those were the 4.
Mm.
What's interesting about the Supreme National Tribunal proceedings against Höss and also against Göth, Amon Göth, who was the commandant of the Plaszow camp, who was involved
Yeah,
in
made famous by Schindler's List.
exactly, yeah, and he was involved in liquidating ghettos and shooting hundreds and hundreds of people.
I think he suffered the same fate as Huss, didn't he? Was he taken to Plazov and
Yeah.
hung there? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I know he was put to death. I can't recall exactly where that. Probably it was in Plaszow. I don't know. But what the Supreme National Tribunal did, in addition to charging their defendants with murder, which was specifically contemplated by the decree of August 31st, 1944, specifically talks about holding the Nazis accountable for committing acts of murder. It did not say genocide, but what the court is going to do, the Supreme National Tribunal is going to do, is to read into the reference to murder in the original decree of August 31st, 1944. They're going to read genocide into the definition of murder and then add that as a charge against the Nazis, against Höss. And I can't recall whether Goeth was charged with genocide or not. I'd have to go back and look at the case. I can't remember. Certainly murder and mass murder, crimes against humanity. But of course, Höss was charged with genocide as the commandant or former commandant of Auschwitz. And they took it a step further. They not only charged him with genocide, they also charged him with membership in a criminal organization. And that criminal organization was Auschwitz. They defined the Auschwitz administration as being an inherently criminal organization, so that membership in it was more or less enough to sustain a conviction.
Yeah.
On a theory of collective liability, kind of like a conspiracy. It's sort of like a conspiracy count where
Yeah. We're talking about Germany in the Germans in the 1940s, most of them very well educated. They knew what they were doing was highly, highly criminal. We're not talking, people from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. If I'm right in thinking, the German legal code and legal studies and legal academia from Germany was some of the world's leading principles and legal scholars, and came from Germany, didn't it? And it was adopted over the pond where you are and in Britain, all around the world.
I actually wrote a textbook called Comparative Law, Global Legal Traditions with some other colleagues. And I was responsible for the chapters on Germany because we thought that Germany was the example par excellence of the civil legal tradition. And it is. The more I delved into it, the more convinced I was that this was, the leading, really, I think the leading exemplar, along with France, perhaps, but certainly Germany was right there as the leading exemplar of uh, of the civil legal tradition. And people, like, I was at the Max Planck Institute for International and Foreign Criminal Law doing my dissertation research in 1999. And people, scholars were coming in, young people from all over the world were coming to the Max Planck Institute to study German law. So Koreans and Saudi Arabians and Iranians and Chinese nationals, and you name it, from people from all over the world, including myself. I was there as
Mm.
well, studying German law as it pertained to Nazi atrocities. But most of the people there were studying German law in order to take their findings with them back to their home countries and contribute to the development of their own law. I mean, our own Uniform Commercial Code here in the United States is deeply influenced by German legal principles, especially the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch, the Code of Civil Law, which was written in the late 19th century, had an enormous impact on American commercial law. I could go on and on and on with the influence of German law, very salutary, very, positive sorts of influences of German law. So your point is very well taken. We're not talking about a backward, country with a primitive, like customary legal system in which the principles have not been sufficiently developed and has not achieved a level of systematicity. That's not the case in Germany. Germany was at the very apex of legal development in the world. And perhaps we could talk a little bit about this too when we talk about the Auschwitz trial itself. It became a major issue, not only at the Auschwitz trial, but also the Operation Reinhardt trials. They all had to take up this issue of Hitler's authority as a lawmaker and the status of the final solution as a legal phenomenon. Was it a legal event or an illegal event? And those issues had to be sorted out, right? Because
Yeah.
if it was a legal event, there are problems from a legal standpoint in prosecuting the defendants. Because the defendants could simply say that I thought that what I was doing was legal. And if in fact the final solution was a legal event, then they would have lacked a critical element needed to convict somebody of murder under German law, which was the consciousness of illegality. And I guess in the United States, we sometimes refer to this as specific intent, or the mens rea, or specific intent to commit a crime. Well, if they thought that what they were doing was ordered and legal, then where is the consciousness of illegality? And this was a really serious issue. And, I took a look at this in preparation for our podcast, just to refresh my memory on the testimony of Hans Buchan, who specifically addressed this issue in this case, in the Auschwitz trial, and also at the Treblinka trial. He offered the same testimony there because the issue became a pregnant one there as well.
Yeah, Nazi lawyers were absolutely instrumental in the Nazi system and the Holocaust. They knew how to weaponize the law in their favor. Especially once World War II started, the amount of decrees that they used to pass in occupied territories, the dizzying amount of decrees, and they're essentially legalizing the most thuggish illegal behavior, or giving it a veneer of legality. And if the people that you're wishing to carry out these orders have a belief that they're behaving inside the law, then they're probably more likely to commit these atrocities. And obviously as well, we have lawyers deeply involved in the Einsatzgruppen leaders would probably be the best example of this. On the ground, blood on their hands, murdering people. I think lots of the Einsatzgruppen leaders had doctorates.
Yeah.
And then at Vancy, I think 9 of the people at Vancy had doctorates in law as well. So, and then this second Auschwitz trial, then, so 40 people, and the Poles weren't playing about, were they? Like the trials that we're looking at, the Ulm trial, and then we'll save exactly what judgments were given at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial until later. but we have 23 death sentences handed down from the Auschwitz trial, and the whole thing took 2 months. When we're talking about West German trials, we're talking months into years. There's 40 people here. So, for example, later trials, West German trials, we're talking much less people, and we're talking it spans over a much longer span of time, and then we get reduced sentences. These are quick, they're snappy, and then so the sentence. So the trial begins in November 1947, and these 23 people are executed in January 1948. So it's just bish, bash, bosh. So yeah, you're guilty. And I'll read one thing that the court said before we start segueing into the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. But I thought that this was quite poignant and just like quite well put. It says torturing of prisoners already tormented to the extreme is the evidence of inhuman savagery perpetrated by those defendants who, as a result of their trial, are sentenced to death. The listed violent crimes committed by named defendants, who all took smaller or larger or a larger part in the mass murder of prisoners, also reveal that the accused were involved in the acts of killing for pleasure and not for pursuant to orders of their superiors. If it were not for their expressed desire to kill, they would otherwise have displayed elements of sympathy for the victims, or at least shown indifference to their plight, but not tortured them to death. And like, well, yeah, can't really argue with that, can you?
Yeah, it's interesting they use the term torture, which of course is under German law one of the classic expressions of the excess perpetrator. The idea that a person who goes above and beyond the order and fully identifies with and internalizes the ideology, the hateful, the racial animus of the Nazi state. That person cannot simply invoke superior orders as a defense, because he has identified himself as an excess perpetrator. And torture is the classic example of this for the German legal system, especially as it confronted the crimes at Auschwitz. So a person like Wilhelm Boger, for example, maybe we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about
We
him.
will indeed, yeah.
Wilhelm
Well, yeah.
Boger, what did him, and he was convicted as a perpetrator, not just as an accessory, but as a perpetrator, as what we would say in the United States, probably in Britain too, is a principle. It's a concept of the common law, right? The principles and accessories or accomplices. Well, he was identified as a principal, even though he was fairly low on the in the chain of command. But that was because of his Boger Swing, that sadistic device that he.
Yeah, we'll get onto that later. Actually, I've got a diagram of it, and
Oh, good. Yeah,
yeah. Let's hold that thought for a bit. Yeah, but it wasn't like these people were just being summarily executed and weren't getting a fair trial in 1947, because one perpetrator, well, I don't think we can call, well, I don't know if we could call him a perpetrator or not. He was acquitted. He's called Sergeant Major Hans Münch, and it was found that he refused to participate in the selection process, and that he made futile, although confirmed, requests for food for the prisoners.
Right.
And because of that, he was acquitted. So you can see it's not a kangaroo court. They're getting some semblance of a fair trial here. And what's going against the perpetrators that were meted down these death sentences is we have quite a lot of, because it had that, Auschwitz was this huge sprawling complex, and it had that function of being a penal colony, a slave labor repository, and a killing center. We have quite a lot of survivors, and also they would recruit people, and also the perpetrators. If perpetrators are not standing trial, other perpetrators are quite happy to throw each other under the bus. So they will. So testifying against the perpetrators on the stand, you've got other perpetrators, you've got maybe other prisoners that were there. Some of them are recruited to work inside maybe the infirmary or or different institutions within Auschwitz, and then you've got people that were being used as slave labor. So there's quite a lot of witnesses to their crimes, and then you can cross-reference this as well. You can cross-reference witness and perpetrator testimony against this person, and then they're like tying themselves in knots and quite obviously lying if they are denying this as well.
Yeah, of course. The whole case begins when a former prisoner reports Boger.
Yeah.
Is that how,
Let's
1958, is that how the case starts? The whole investigation begins.
Let's get to the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial then, because I think we're heading that way anyway. And I'll share screen because I've got some interesting pictures. And we said that we would choose 3 people basically to talk about each. So we'll do that, and then other people will come up along the way. But I wanted to show a little bit of a video just before the last thing before we get to the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, because this has got Hans Münch in it, and he talks about perpetrator motivations, and we're both deeply involved in perpetrator studies. So I thought this would be an interesting one to watch. Can you see that on the screen? Yeah.
Certainly can. Yeah.
Okay, let's just watch the first 90 seconds of this, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about it, and then we'll move into the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial itself.
The extermination camp at Auschwitz, a permanent reminder of the Holocaust.
Can you hear that?
At the beginning of the 1960s, old crimes catch up with West Germany. Fritz Bauer, a state prosecutor of Jewish descent, brings the perpetrators in front of a court of law. The trial meets opposition. Many follow the proceedings with suspicion and want to draw a line under events of the past. Eventually, in 1963, the trial gets underway in Frankfurt.
The High Court in Frankfurt am Main is in session.
20 defendants are facing trial. What were the motives of those accused Holocaust perpetrators? These ardent National Socialists swear allegiance to Hitler. Are they fanatical criminals or compliant helpers?
They were completely normal people, no different from anyone else. The only distinction was that on average, there were more opportunists than one usually finds in everyday life.
They viewed their murderous service as a career opening, a chance to get ahead in the Nazi regime.
They realized, if I'm a party member, I'll get advantages. And if I'm with the SS, I'll get even more advantages. And if I'm part of a special group of the SS, I'll be top of the pile.
So that was what I wanted to listen to, mainly Hans Münch. And I'm just interested his assessment of perpetrator motivations then, when you were listening to what he was saying, did that align with what you see when you're thinking about perpetrators working at Auschwitz?
No, it actually didn't. No. Obviously, Hans Münch was in a better position, much better position than I ever will be, to observe perpetrator behavior. But let's not forget that many of these people were members of the SS, and the SS was an indoctrinated group of people. I'm sure that many of them, at least from a psychological standpoint, probably were normal, in the sense they probably did not suffer from, like a DSM-5 sort of mental disorder, a diagnosable mental disorder. They assuredly were not insane, but they were members of the SS. And people would join the SS for different reasons, I've no doubt, but that Münch's point, as it pertains to some of them, probably is well taken. Many of them probably joined for careerist purposes or in order to advance their advantages in some way or another. But this ordinary men kind of template which of course was popularized by Christopher Browning in his justly celebrated study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 in Poland, I think has application to many of the crimes of the final solution, but does not apply to others, right? And I'm not sure that it really applies all that well to the guards at Auschwitz, insofar as most of them, the overwhelming number of them, were SS.
Yeah.
And the SS was hardly a neutral group like the Rotarians, or the Kiwanis Club, or here in the United States, just some sort of an innocuous charitable group. No, I mean, people who belonged to the SS were inculcated in its racial ideology. So
Yeah.
I can't agree with Münch's take here.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I saw, and to hear him say it, I thought, wow, he's just confirmed the overwhelming thoughts that I've had towards when I did my study of the SS of Treblinka. That's a bit different because lots of them were just getting SS uniforms on the way into the killing center, so it's a different case. But I suppose this is a very complex issue, but a very important one, and it's that kind of argument. Was it? I see status and prestige as things that human beings want, and then in Auschwitz, obviously, there's innumerable riches that you can take, and it means that you're not fighting on the Eastern Front as well, and this status and this prestige that people got. But also, can we section off ideology from material gain? Because maybe you're more ideologically driven down to follow a particular direction when there's material benefits as well. So I think ideology and material interest, they interact with each other as well, and they're not. We can't clearly delineate them from each other.
Yeah, and even one's amor propria is directly connected to these ideologies of racial superiority and inferiority. If you have a government telling you that you belong to the top group, to whom all benefits should flow, that's a fairly enticing offer, I think, or would be an enticing offer for many people. So yeah, again, it's not so easy to disentangle these motives. Oftentimes they are kind of inextricably entangled with each other.
Yeah. And Munch was a really fascinating guy. In later life, he met with survivors, and I think he even went to different Holocaust sites with survivors. So he'd be, if we were ever going to do a podcast just focusing on people, I'm sure he would be a fascinating person to look at. Right, let's have a look at some of the pictures then associated with the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. So, like the Ulm trial that we were talking about, it's quite a significant trial because the press were really interested in it, and it was closely followed by a lot of people that didn't really have any Holocaust consciousness before. Well, the word Holocaust wasn't being used, but the Nazi destruction of the European Jewry wasn't something that was known really in Germany before the trial, but especially the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial played a major role, and you can see all the press in this photograph are very interested. And I thought this picture was quite interesting because it just looks like it's been taken on a movie set. And the guy on the left is Johann Schobert. He's a perpetrator, a defendant, and then you've got the defense counsel there as well. He doesn't look like a man that's being charged with the most heinous crimes imaginable. And then we have Fritz Bauer. Obviously, we can't do this podcast without talking about Fritz Bauer. What a force of nature. What an incredible guy. What an incredible life that he led as well, Michael.
One of my true heroes. I don't say that about a lot of people, but I will say that about him. Yeah.
Yeah. And he led a very interesting life before and after the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. Do you know anything about his life before he came back to West Germany in 1949?
Yeah, at one time I could have answered that question, but I haven't read his biography in about 25 years. So it's my
Well,
memory is a little
ju-
dim, but maybe you can fill in
just
the
to
details.
just to touch on a couple of things. So he was arrested really earlier on. I think he was either a member of the Social Democrats or he was working with them, and he was interned in a concentration camp. And in March 1933, so straight away after the Nazis come to power, he's one of the first people that's been targeted. And he actually signs something which he refused to ever talk about later in life, where I think he pledged allegiance to get released. He pledged allegiance to the Nazi system, just like a way of degrading and humiliating him and kind of breaking his spirit so they'd release him. So he did that, and then he fled to Denmark in 1936. And just an interesting kind of personal encounter that he had. He was arrested there for sleeping with a male prostitute. And it wasn't illegal to have homosexual intercourse in Denmark, but it was illegal to pay for sex. And he said that he had sex with this guy, but he said that he hadn't paid for it. And that just adds another layer of interest to this story of Bauer. And then in 1940, when Denmark became essentially a Nazi vassal state, he was interned for a little while, and then he fled to Sweden. He was one of those people that were able to make safe passage to Sweden before then coming back to Germany. And he was one of those people that was not relentlessly pursuing convictions when it was so unpopular at that time in the Federal Republic. Most people didn't want to touch this with a barge pole, and he was one of those people. Another person was Hermann Langbein as well, who was pursuing convictions, and he is on the next slide here. He was actually a political prisoner, and he was, again, if there's two people that were instrumental in bringing about the trial of these perpetrators in 1963, between 1963 and 1965 for the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, it was these two. And I think in the end there was about 21 perpetrators were brought to trial, and it was a massive undertaking because there was 319 witnesses, and they're including survivors from the camp and members of the camp staff and the SS and police. People that weren't being tried at that point were coming in and testifying against their ex-comrades as well. And you can see some of the perpetrators here, and we're going to talk, I think, about four of these gentlemen here we're going to talk about during this podcast. It's an interesting case because of the publicity, and also they did a fact-finding mission to Auschwitz during the trial to see if what witnesses and perpetrators were saying could have happened. So could he have seen that from where he was? Could he have heard that from where he was? And in the foreground here, this is actually a perpetrator. So it wasn't just the two counsels, the prosecution and defense, that went, and different witnesses. They actually took perpetrators back to Auschwitz as well. And another one of these photographs. So we were having a bit of a look at these in the Ulm trial, where the perpetrators cover their face, and I don't know, there's something quite satisfying for me about seeing these. And do you know, Michael, who this gentleman is here, covering his face?
It's hard to tell because he has something held in front of his face. I recognize that scalp. No, I'm not sure what it is. It's not,
Okay.
not Boger, is it? Or Molka?
No. Yes, you are right. It is this gentleman here, which is Mulker. And yeah, I'm wondering why he's covering his face here. maybe he just wants them to, in that moment, because we know what he looks like. Everybody knew what he looked like at the time, and he's giving here. This is him at the courtroom giving an interview to press, which is quite interesting as well, isn't it? That the perpetrators would be able during like the proceedings to be interviewed by the press, and then have their photographs taken with press as well. So yeah, this is Mulker, and another. It always happens that these Nazis, they look like who they are, don't they? There's something very malicious about his face, about his look. And he was one of the people, Michael, that you were going to talk about, right, Mulker?
That's right. There were three individuals that I think we took three each, didn't we?
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
He was on my list. So.
And what did you find out about him?
So I just jotted down a few notes about
because the trial was actually named after him. I think it was Mulker and another perpetrator versus like the Federal Republic or the people. So he had his name in lights basically for this trial. He was one of the main focal points.
So let's talk a little bit about Mulker. I actually had a little PowerPoint also, but you already have his image up, so I won't bother with my own PowerPoint. His dates are 1895 to 1969. He's from Hamburg. He was the adjutant to Höss at Auschwitz. So this effectively made him second in command at one time, behind Rudolf Hoss. His pre-World War II career, obviously based upon his photograph, you can tell that he was an older guy. So this is not one of the younger defendants, which meant that he actually had served in World War I. And then after the war, he joined what was called the Baltic Landeswehr and fought the Bolsheviks in the Baltic countries. So the Landeswehr was an entire army created by the Livonian nobility. Livonian is the term that was used for the Baltic countries at the time, Livonia. So he actually fought against the communists through this Baltic Landeswehr after the war, and survived that. He went on then to work for an agency firm in post-war Germany until 1931, and then he leaves and he works independently in the import-export trade. So I think he had his own firm, or at least was freelancing in that area. And it was during this time, too, from 1928 to 1934, that he had joined the Stahlhelm. So this is one of the extreme right-wing parties circulating in Weimar Germany. Eventually, it will be absorbed, of course, by the National Socialists. But at the time, it was an independent party. He became a reserve lieutenant, or I should say, a first lieutenant in the reserves, until he was, interestingly enough, he was convicted of a crime. He was charged with receiving stolen property. He was convicted for that. And it's interesting that this left a blemish on his career, I think, in his own mind, that would then perhaps, in a very fateful way, lead him in a certain direction that eventually took him to Auschwitz. The war breaks out, of course, 1939. Moltke unsuccessfully tried to regain his officer's commission. These attempts were all unavailing. And so he then joins the Nazi Party in 1940. So this is an older guy who had no previous direct affiliation with the Nazis. Now, he had belonged to the Stahlhelm, which was fairly extreme in its own way. It was a kind of a folkish sort of folk national political party, but he did not join the Nazis until 1940, fairly late. And so he then applies for a commissioned officer position again with the SS. His attempts to do this through the army had failed. So now he joins the Waffen-SS as an Obersturmführer, and he becomes a company leader of a sapper, what's called a sapper unit. This is combat engineering. They're called sappers. He eventually becomes ill, is declared ineligible for anything other than garrison service within the Reich. And so now this opens the door to his assignment to Auschwitz. He's deployed because of this restriction in his deployability based upon this whatever illness he was suffering from at the time. He is sent to Auschwitz. The camp's commandant, or I should say the camp commandant's adjutant, became ill shortly after his arrival. And so Moltke then succeeded this individual who was not able to continue as the adjutant to Höss. And Moltke becomes Höss's adjutant. He actually became chief of staff of Höss's office at Birkenau specifically.
Wow. So that's for him. I bet he was pretty happy with that. That's
lofty. A lofty assignment. I mean, really.
Yeah, it's worked out quite well for him. That guy's got sick, and then he's been given this lofty assignment. It'll be, they've had the uniform as well, the title. Sure. So now he's an important person.
And clearly, now he actually may very much conform to that image that
of status.
That the expert that you showcased in your film was talking about, a person who was driven by careerist sorts of motives, and very clearly from early on he was trying to regain his commissioned officer position with the military, and he couldn't because of his prior conviction for receiving stolen property.
And and I think he's in his mid to late 40s as well. So he hasn't got buckets of time to spare. If he's going to make something of himself, it's got to be now.
Yeah, so I actually think that definition of the careerist, an ordinary person, ordinary man at Auschwitz, I think really kind of fits Moltke to a certain extent. That's why when you asked the question about that testimony concerning ordinary people at Auschwitz, I wavered a bit, because I think that there were some people to whom it might have applied, but a lot of them it wouldn't apply to because they were much more hardcore. He strikes me as more of an opportunist. But it's interesting. His time as an adjutant and chief of staff comes to an end because he was accused of making a derogatory comment about Goebbels.
Oh, really? Wow.
He was demoted to SS Obersturmführer. He then is transferred back to Hamburg, where he was from, in mid-1943. He worked for the higher SS and police command in Hamburg, and then worked as a sapper again in Prague, and then was transferred back to Hamburg. And this is where he was when the war came to an end. He was back in his hometown.
So, yeah. So he'd said something about Goebbels, and then someone he thought he was safe to say this to or around just went and completely ratted him in.
Yeah. I mean, not unusual at the time, right? A lot of people were turning each other in over listening to foreign radio broadcasts, and which actually carried a capital punishment with it at that time. A lot of people turning other people in. Post-war career is kind of typical for a lot of these lower level perpetrators. So he goes back after the end of the war. He goes back to his import-export company and resumes his career from the late 1920s and early 30s. He's then arrested in 1948 and jailed because of his SS membership. He was denazified. He went through a denazification proceeding. He was actually sentenced to 1.5 years prison. So even though I didn't see a reference to this in the literature I looked at, I assume you would have a better understanding of this than I do, Jonny, because you've actually written on the topic of denazification. But he must have been considered belastet, I would think. Belastet was the term that was used. It means compromised, right?
Yeah. Well, it looks like they found out he was a member of the SS.
Not only a member, but
But
he was adjutant to Herz at Auschwitz. So he was sentenced to 1.5 years prison, but they suspended the sentence. And he just, returned to civilian life up until the late 1950s, when he is reported through the typical, at the time, sort of the typical way of bringing a crime to trial was for a private citizen, or it could be an organization too, I guess. But typically there was a report that was filed by an individual or organization incriminating or leveling an accusation against another person for committing a crime. And that's what happened with Boger when he was discovered by the capo. I think his name was Adolf Rogner.
surprising how much this happens, isn't it? That they get seen, don't they? And you can imagine the horror, especially if you'd been a victim of that camp and he'd worked there at the same time, and you see him out in public.
Which is apparently what happened with Boger.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Zentrale Stelle, the central office, becomes involved. Initially, it was Stuttgart that had jurisdiction over the case, and then the Stelle, the central office in Ludwigsburg, takes it over and conducts and expands the investigation to include all of Auschwitz, not just Boger and his work, but to include other perpetrators, other people who were involved in the crimes of the camp. And the International Auschwitz Committee, you mentioned Langbein, who was the president or the head of the International Auschwitz Committee, they get involved in providing names and trying to trace the whereabouts of some of these people. And the whole thing sort of unravels. And one person after another then is swept up, including Molke. And Molke is very interesting, the way in which they discovered him, because he was living, again, a fairly quiet life up until 1960. So at this point in 1960, this is something you know about already, Jonny, but for maybe our listeners who don't know this history directly, you have the case starting at Stuttgart. It's then taken over by the central office. But then Fritz Bauer, whom you talked about, who was the how would you translate that into English? He would be, I guess, like the district attorney general in Frankfurt. Bauer actually received files from various sources, including former prisoners in the camp. He received 5 very incriminating files, which essentially gave him a jurisdictional basis to take over the case. And so he files an application with the basically the Supreme Court in Germany, the Bundesgerichtshof. And the Bundesgerichtshof agrees with Bauer and orders that the case be transferred then from the central office in Ludwigsburg to Frankfurt. Now, there was a lawyer in Bauer's office who was working on the case once it was transferred to Frankfurt. This is in 1960. And he must have also been a sports fan. I don't know, but he was apparently reading an article about the German Olympic yachting team. And in the course of the article, there's a reference made to one of the members of this team. It was a very prominent yachtsman. And his name was Rolf Molke.
Right.
Rolf Molke.
Yeah.
So this lawyer who had been, surveying and reviewing the files from Auschwitz, trying to build this case and to identify other defendants who might be charged, or potential defendants who could be charged. He says, wait a second, I've heard that name before. Apparently it's an unusual name in German.
Right. I was just wondering, is it not very common?
It's not common, according to what I've read.
So that's one of the things that's led to this guy's downfall then.
Yeah, exactly. So he said, wait a second. Where have I seen this before? So he goes back in the records and he finds a reference to a Robert Molke. And he does some legwork and is able to verify that Robert Molke is the father of Rolf Molke.
Right.
And he's able in that way then to identify this guy, whose picture appears on our screen, as the adjutant to Hoss. Of course, he is then arrested and interrogated. And as they say, the rest is history, right?
I wonder if he ever considered changing his name, because we were talking about Bernhard Fischer-Schroeder, and he did, didn't he? And that threw them off his scent for a while. But I don't know. Maybe it was just complete arrogance, or well, we know that what the atmosphere, what the environment was like in West Germany, and he probably thought nobody's going to come for me. I'll be fine.
I've been
There's so
denazified.
many of us.
I've been denazified, right? And,
I've been Nazified, and it's not like I'm the only Nazi. Why would they come for me? Like, they must have bigger fish to fry than me, he must be thinking. But at the same time, he knew that he was second in command at Auschwitz at one point. And do you know, at the court case, what was it just his seniority that was criminal, or were there any individual excesses?
Let's talk. It was not proven that he acted from excess, which ensured that he would be treated as an accomplice and not as a perpetrator. Very important, right, in terms of the punishment.
Yeah, for him, yeah.
So he was 69 years old at the time the trial started. You can see his photograph. Yeah. He's an older man. Yeah. And he looks even older than 60. He looks like he's in his 80s, but I guess this is what criminal prosecution for really serious offenses can do to your appearance, apparently. He was married, he had a daughter, and then I think he had 2 sons. Yeah, he had a couple of sons. One of them was the yachtsman. So this is what the Landgericht, the trial court, said about Moltke. They said that he made significant contributions to Birkenau, specifically in developing the gassing facilities. They actually had evidence in the form of testimony and apparently some documentary evidence as well that he assisted with the construction of 4 of the Birkenau crematoria and gas chamber complexes. They also had evidence that he was involved in selecting arriving transports of Jews. So he was on the ramp and was conducting these selections that would determine whether a person would go to to work on behalf of IG Farben, or work in one of the SS in industrial enterprises within the camp, or would then go to the gas chamber, where he was involved in making those selections from time to time. So he was convicted then of, in German, it's called Beihilfe zum Mord, so aiding and abetting murder, basically complicity to murder. In the murders of 750 people on at least 4 occasions. And he was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but he was convicted as an accomplice, and not as a perpetrator, not as a principal, not as a perpetrator. He tried to commit suicide in prison and was not able to do so. He was only in prison a few years. Of course, he was in pretrial confinement too, so that would have to be added. But he was really not in prison all that long, given the severity of his offenses. He was released in 1968 on compassionate grounds, and then died in Hamburg, his hometown. He died in 1969 at the age of 74.
Yeah. Right. So it sounds like his health was really deteriorating, because you see some of these people that are released on compassionate grounds, and then they don't die for 20 years.
Yeah, I know. In his case, I think he really was ailing.
Yeah,
the fact that
and they were just like, well, he's basically can barely walk anyway or leave a room. Why are we looking after him? Like, just pass him over to a nursing home or something, and they can see out his last days.
So I just wanted to make one more comment, and then maybe we could move on. But Landgericht talked about Moltke in its assessment of his contributions to Auschwitz. And it said that he was a cog in the total extermination machine. I'm just quoting from the verdict here, which functioned through the cooperation of numerous people. The court was not convinced that he had a great deal of control over the flow of events in the camp, even though he was fairly high in the food chain within the Auschwitz administration.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, the court found that he really could not structure the course of events hardly at all. He had very, very limited ability to do that. And for this reason, then he was convicted as an accomplice and not as a principal. Right. And there was no evidence of the excess taten, as they were called, the excess, like sadistic acts or acting over and above one's orders, which would have provided
Yeah.
a legal
Well,
basis.
yeah, according to the law that he's been tried with, if it had been proven that he'd have taken his fists to one individual
Different story.
and
Think of
that
Boger.
individual had been murdered, but he can funnel with his agency an unlimited amount of people into a gas chamber, but that would be an accomplice to murder.
Which leads to a strange kind of antinomy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you think, and again,
Morally, it just doesn't make sense, does it, to you?
And I'm struck by the numbers of academics. There were several scholars. I mentioned Devin Pindus, who wrote a book on this topic. Rebecca Whitman wrote a book on the Auschwitz trial. And there are several others, too, who kind of marvel at this. Because there are some perpetrators, like Boger, for example, whom we can also talk about if you'd like.
Yeah.
Boger, who was convicted both as a perpetrator and as an accomplice, and he's actually given more time for the crimes he committed as a perpetrator, even though it involved far fewer people.
Mm.
He killed thousands or contributed to the deaths of thousands of people as an accomplice and received less time for that than the punishment he got for killing just a handful of people as a perpetrator. And so for a lot of academics, this is just incomprehensible. But I think that if you follow the law, it does, from a legal standpoint, it makes a certain degree of sense. Again, I'm not endorsing it from a moral or ethical standpoint. I'm just simply saying that there's a structural feature to this that is very legal and, really calls into question whether the Germans should ever have subjected Nazi crimes to the analysis of purely German law. That is paragraph 211 of the German code, the German legal code.
Because it's not serving as a deterrent. If anything like this would ever happen again, people have got a precedent that I can be involved in these criminal organizations and I can follow the orders of my superiors, no matter how heinous. It doesn't get any more heinous than funneling people into a gas chamber. So, according to German law, as long as somebody's told me to do it, basically the worst thing that can happen to me is a few years. And then if I've got a decent lawyer, I'll be able to get out, good behavior, maybe. Lots of them, pretended, and people are purchasable. So I can pay a psychiatrist or maybe even a doctor that says that I'm ill, or maybe, Kurt Franz, the Treblinka perpetrator, he eventually gets lots of day releases, and he's able to get out of incarceration regularly because his wife's ill. So there's ways out, but it's what it isn't, and the law should be doing is serving as a deterrent for people that are thinking about doing this in future. And if you can be second in command of Auschwitz and funnel people into gas chambers, but just get a slap on the wrists, and then
and really, Jonny, this gets back to, again, the issue of the status of the final solution as a legal phenomenon. Was it law or not? Because if it was law, then I think the Germans were in a really, really bad place in terms of holding these offenders accountable, because they could always appeal to the fact that they didn't understand that what they were doing was illegal. Now, the Germans twisted themselves into knots. I'm talking about the German courts in particular. They twisted themselves into knots to try to beat back this defense. It was really the defense of the lack of awareness that what they were doing was illegal. Yeah, it's a part of the what in America, what the United States is called the ex post facto defense, and under continental law is called the principle of legality. The idea that you can't, the nulla or nullum crimen principle, you can't prosecute for something that was not illegal at the time that he or she did the act. Right. Yeah. So no matter how morally abhorrent the order for the final solution may have been, if it was law, then arguably these individuals could make the defense that they didn't realize that what they were doing was illegal.
And of course they did do that very regularly. That was kind of the main defense, wasn't it?
It was a big one, superior orders. They called it, Befehlsnotstand in German, which is sort of
Probably,
superior orders. Yeah.
if you looked at all the trials, by far the most common defense and the most successful one as well. And these defendants, you can see when you see the footage of the courtroom and different pictures, they know that there's no death penalty in West Germany, so they know they're not going to be killed. And I think they know as well that it's going to be really difficult to sentence them as excess perpetrators.
Not
Especially,
impossible, because Boger was considered an excess perpetrator.
and here he is here, and sat behind him here is Capesius as well, who is known as the druggist or the pharmacist of Auschwitz. And this is not a very good quality image, but I wanted to include it because I've been reading about this guy's behavior in the court. And at one point, the judge said to him, and he wasn't even on the stand at the time, about his behavior, because he was there. He'd gone in dark glasses, and he wore dark glasses for the entire thing. He was behaving a little bit like he thought he was a movie star, and he was laughing, he was joking throughout the entire thing. And if you think about what is being spoken about, the survivors that are there, to say that this behavior was inappropriate is obviously, quite frankly, an understatement. And he was a pharmacist. He was a Romanian pharmacist, and according to an agreement with Romania and Nazi Germany, he joined the Waffen SS in 1943, and then in December 1943 he was transferred to Auschwitz, and he was working in the pharmacy there. So he was supplying the drugs for the medical experiments of Mengele. Mengele was his superior, and he worked with Mengele closely, and he was also working with Klaus Klauberg closely, another quite famous doctor that worked in Auschwitz. And at the trial, he was accused of several things, and he was, because of his Romanian and Hungarian affiliations, he was recognized quite often by some of the witnesses, the victims that had gone there. And one person, a witness called Nabel, had actually lived in the same house as him from 1935 to 1938. And she said, because he was trying to deny that he was on the ramp directing people left or right, sending them to their deaths. And she said, yeah, I know him. I used to live on the second floor. He was on the ground floor, and I saw him on the ramp, and he was one of the people that sent me one way. And then a survivor called Adrienne Kraus testified that she saw him wave his hand, and she went one way, and her father, her mother, and the sister were sent by Capesius to their deaths. And then there was one of the most interesting testimonies is a guy called Dr. Schlinger, and he knew Capesius, so he went up to him, and he was like on the ramp, and he said, okay, so what's happening here? And Capesius lies to him and says everything's going to be fine. And Dr. Schlinger does what I suppose all of us would do in this situation if you were with your wife and she wasn't completely healthy and you didn't know what this place was about or what was about to happen. He says to Capesius, my wife is not completely healthy. And it's just so tragic that obviously he thought he was doing the right thing for his wife, but you couldn't really have said a worse thing at that point. If you want your wife to have any chance of survival, you do not want to say that she's not completely healthy. And Capesius says, oh, she should go there then, very calmly apparently. And that was the last time that he ever saw his wife, because she was taken and she was murdered straight away because she wasn't seen as useful. And there was another testimony is by this guy called Dr. Berner, who also knew Capesius, knew of. No, he'd done business with him before. I think he'd bought a pharmacy and an establishment off him, and Dr. Berner, arrived at Auschwitz, and it's just beyond imagination that he was there with his two twin daughters and an older, I think his twin daughters were about 9 years old, and then he was there with a 12-year-old daughter and his wife, and they'd arrived in Auschwitz, and he was talking to Capesius briefly, and he said, Captain, I have these two twin children that really need protection, because they were the youngest that he was with, so he was trying to get them protection first. And apparently Capesius said, and this is again like the guy that said, oh, my wife's ill, thinking that that's going to benefit her situation, telling these monsters that you have some twins when Mengele's about is obviously not a good thing to do. It's a fate worse than death to have that sadistic individual use them as playthings for his warped experiments. So Capesius runs after these twins, and then he takes them to Mengele, and Mengele, for some reason, doesn't want them. Maybe he's got enough twins at this point. So Capesius, he brings them back, and he sends them to the line, which means their immediate death. But they're keeping Dr. Berner and quite a few of these other doctors because they think they might be useful, so he's sent the other way. And Dr. Capesius says to Berner that they're only going swimming, they'll be back in an hour. And then this is the last. Dr. Berner then sees his 38-year-old wife, his eldest daughter, who was 12 and a half years old, and his twins, Helga and Nora, who are 9.5 years old. He sees them for the last time go walk towards their deaths, although he didn't know it at that time, but that was obviously where they'd gone. Other crimes that Dr. Capesius is accused of, and this particular crime, there's 3 different witnesses. There's a guy called Dr. Kledzinski, and he was a Polish lung specialist who the Nazis had working for them in Auschwitz. And then there were Professor Dr. Fejkiel and another witness as well, that all said that he had taken part in the executed SS doctor, Dr. Roeder, some of his anesthesia experiments. So, and they all said that Capesius added a drug called Epivan to this coffee and then gave it to 4 prisoners, and that these prisoners drank it and 2 of them died. And what I thought was interesting when I was reading these court proceedings is the prosecution counsel actually says, unless we know about the dose, we can't determine the defendant's intent in this undertaking. Like, for me, that is murder. He's a pharmacist. He's put this crap in somebody's coffee without them knowing about it, and then he's got them to drink it and they've died. That's not manslaughter. That's straight up murder. And I thought it was interesting that the prosecution said that as well, like about we don't know the dose, so we don't know if he meant to kill them or not. And then a couple of other things that he was accused of. The main things is that Capesius was a rapacious thief. So where he worked was the same place where that's Boger, so we'll save that, was the same place where the gold teeth were stored. So Capesius starts helping himself to this, and he starts sending suitcases. He also goes down to Canada, the section where all the victims' belongings are kept, and he'll help himself to, like, whatever he wants, basically. He'll go shopping down there. But mainly it's these gold teeth. And he's been seen by different witnesses with suitcases full of dentures that he sends these back home. And I just thought he was quite an interesting case because he was a pharmacist, and we don't often think about these medical practitioners and their role in the perpetration of Auschwitz. He also would very cynically drive around in a Red Cross vehicle as well. Obviously, deception was key in Auschwitz, and he would supply the Zyklon B as well. So he was implicated a lot in the crimes in Auschwitz. Have you heard about this guy before, Michael?
Yes, I mean, I mentioned some of the books on the topic of the Auschwitz trial, and they all refer to Capesius. I think. How did you pronounce his name?
Capesius.
I don't know I don't know what the correct pronunciation is. I thought it was
Or Capesius. I'm not sure.
Capesius, but I could be wrong. I don't know. But yeah, they all refer to him and talk about his villainies, his malefactions in the camp. And I guess I would ask you where he would fall in this spectrum of perpetration, right? We were talking earlier about this notion of ordinary men versus, ideological killers who are possessed with racial hatred.
Yeah.
Where do you see him on that spectrum?
I don't see him as ideologically driven. Apparently, he was married to someone that was half Jewish. And if you look at his past and the things that he said, he wasn't a member, like you mentioned earlier, like Mulker had been a member of like a Volkish movement before the war. He'd never been like politically aligned with any organization like that. I think he was quite clearly a careerist. He did quite well after the war as well, but he was a thief, a careerist. He liked the status. I don't think he really wanted it, and he kept on saying this. He didn't want to be transferred to Auschwitz in the first place. He was quite happy where he was, but when he got there, he realized how to take advantage of it. So I would say he was an absolutely ordinary man.
That's the impression. Yeah, that's the impression I have too. This is why we have to be so careful, right, when we're trying to grade the Holocaust and its perpetrators. There are some who really do fit this description of ordinary men. Certainly the individuals that Browning talks about in his study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 really fit that description quite well. And I think Capesius probably does as well. Boger, not so much. Boger appears to have been a sadist.
Yeah, so...
Speak of the devil. Literally.
Here he
Literally.
is. Yeah. Well, he was called the Tiger of Auschwitz, wasn't he? One of his nicknames. And you mentioned so yeah, Boger was one of yours, so I'll let you talk about him a little bit, and then
be happy to. His date's 1906 to 1977. So again, he's a little bit older, not as old as Moltke, but not a really young guy at the time that he was involved in these crimes in Auschwitz, and certainly at the time of the trial itself, he was not a young man. He was a police commissioner and a concentration camp overseer within the Auschwitz camp. So pre-World War II career, he was born in a small town near Stuttgart as the son of a merchant. He joined the Hitler Youth in his teens. So there's an early connection. Right?
yeah.
An early connection with National Socialism. And not only do you have Hitler Youth, but he was also a member of the Ottomanenbund, which was a folk national or folkish agrarian movement in the 1920s.
Right.
He joined the NSDAP, the National Nazi Party, in 1929. So again, this is an earlier joining of the party than, say, Moltke, who didn't join until 1940. So already you can see how his background is orienting him towards an ideological conception of the world. You can see how sympathetic he would have become, I think, to the ideals and to the tenets of Nazism. He joins the SS then in 1930. And in 1933, he joins the political police. The Germany distinguished, and still distinguishes, between different branches of police. And they had and still have today a branch of the police called the political police that deal with political issues. He joined one of their offices in Stuttgart, his hometown, more or less. I guess he was born right outside of Stuttgart. He became a police commissioner in 1937. And then yet again, another disconcerting sign that this is not quite the ordinary man, right, that some people talk about. He was arrested for significantly roughing up a man who had been in his custody. He was being interrogated. And apparently Boger just beat the living, crap out of this guy.
Yeah.
And he was arrested for it. It's 1937.
Wow, he's arrested. Wow, if the Nazis are arresting you for being violent, then shit.
Yeah, I mean that's a different order of violence, right?
He's a man of violence, and he's been heavily involved in the Nazi system.
But we know, Johnny, that there were SS cases even during the Holocaust, during the final solution. There were SS cases involving SS men who were prosecuted for treating prisoners with excessive brutality. But they weren't charged with, with brutality or with, aggravated assault or whatever we would charge them with today. What were they charged with? They were charged with disobedience to orders.
Yeah.
Because you're not supposed to go above and beyond what you're commanded to.
And you can understand these people are just like, well, sure, you've given me the green light to behave in whatever way I want. We're murderers. Like, and now I've beaten someone up, and all of a sudden I've done something wrong. I'm a contracted killer.
Yeah. In terms of World War II, Boger was transferred to the Stapo, the Staatspolizei, the state police office in a Polish town called Ciechanów. That's the German name. Of course, the Poles and the Germans had different names for the cities. I think in Polish it's Ciechanów, in north central Poland. He was then ordered to set up and command a border police station in another town called Ostrołęka, and then joins an SS police engineer unit in Dresden in 1940. He actually fights at the front for a period of time. And in 1942, by front, I mean the Eastern Front. 1942, he was wounded. And then, after he was wounded, he was sent to Auschwitz 9 months later, after he had recuperated from his wounds. He was assigned to the Auschwitz political department. It makes sense, right? Because he had been working for the political police at one time. So he is sent to the political department in the Auschwitz camp. Very important aspect here, right? Because the political department was recognized as the representative of the Reich Security main office in Auschwitz. And of course, the Reich Security main office in Berlin was the executory office for the final solution. That was Heydrich's office. So his representative in the camp was this political department that Boger now joins. His chief task was camp security. So you can see, in connection with camp security, how he is going to become heavily involved in interrogating prisoners. And it's in this context then, and there he is, that he creates the so-called Boger Swing, which was actually described by his secretary after the war. I actually pulled up the Wikipedia page in which...
Yeah, Frau Braun.
Frau Braun. I could read that, or other people could just read it on their own. We might be pressed for time. They could always read it on their own, but his secretary...
Why don't you describe how this thing worked and what it was and what he was doing?
See it. I mean, that's actually a pretty realistic drawing of it. It was a horizontal bar that was suspended from the ceiling, and the prisoner was taken, and his legs then were draped over the top bar, and then his hands then were shackled, or I guess manacled would be the right term. Was manacled then to his ankles, sometimes to his shins, but you can see how this created a situation in which the prisoner was completely defenseless. You would then have another, camp guard standing behind the prisoner who's suspended by his legs, by his knees from the horizontal bar, who would take a crowbar and just beat the prisoner on the buttocks and sometimes on the back and sometimes on the legs.
And the genitals would be exposed as well, near the buttocks as well.
Absolutely. And they would also absorb blows from this overseer. And so Boger then would conduct his interrogations using this method, which looks medieval. I mean, probably was medieval. I don't know what exactly his inspiration was for the Boger Swing, but
I'll just read the end of what Frau Braun said. She says, as the swinging went on, and the wailing victim, who had fainted, was revived, only to faint howling again, the blows continued until only a mass of bleeding pulp hung from before their eyes. Most perished from the ordeal, some sooner, some later. In the end, a sack of bones and flayed flesh and fat was swept along the shambles of that concrete floor to be dragged away.
pretty grim. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a testimony that is quoted in the Wikipedia page on Boger specifically.
It's in the court transcripts as well.
So he ultimately, he also participates in selections on the ramp. So in addition to, his interrogations and really murders of individuals using the Boger Swing, he also participated in selecting people for life or for the gas chambers on the ramp. He was ultimately convicted of aiding and abetting. There's that charge of Beihilfe zum Mord, aiding and abetting murder. He was an accomplice, in other words, to the murder of 1,000 Jews. Arriving in transports. This is his work in selecting people to go to the gas chambers. He was given a 4-year sentence as an aider and abetter of murder for his involvement on the ramp. But he was also convicted of being a perpetrator in connection with the Boger Swing. And even though fewer people were killed in connection with these interrogations, nonetheless, because he was considered a perpetrator then, he was given, I'm looking for here it is, 5 life sentences. He was given 5 life sentences for his work in torturing to death prisoners using the Boger Swing. Again, as I had mentioned before, torture was the example par excellence of an excessive crime, an excess-tat, which transforms a defendant then from potentially being an accomplice into, in the eyes of the law, as being a perpetrator, and typically the perpetrators are more severely punished than the accomplices are.
Yeah. There was a female witness that also testified that a 5-year-old clasping an apple who had jumped off the truck, Boger went up to this 5-year-old and just swung this 5-year-old against the wall and killed him. And this female witness testified that she was forced to clean the wall, and that later on she saw Boger eating this apple while interrogating another prisoner. And Boger's granddaughter has I think it was probably about 10 years ago, this story came out. She learned of what he had done while she was a university student, and this really, really messed her up. And a quote that she says is, how can a man who had my picture on his wall have been the same person that smashed a 5-year-old against the wall and ate that apple? So that was something that particularly troubled her.
So, Johnny, where have we seen that practice before of smashing infants against walls, right? This is
a heinous practice that just keeps on popping up and up and up.
Johnny, isn't it interesting that we see these horrific acts carried? I mean, the Boger Swing is, like I said, it's medieval. But it was known. It was not as if this was a secret practice. So the SS assuredly was aware of this. And yet no administrative, no criminal action was made to intervene. We know that there were trials of other SS men who were charged with, as I said before, exceeding their orders and committing torturous killings of Jews in connection with the final solution, and they were charged with disobeying their orders. This never happened to Boger. So what does this suggest? I mean, it suggests to me that this was approved, that this medieval institution of torturous interrogation and killing was approved by the SS, and that Boger was acting within the spirit of the camp. Although he was considered an excess perpetrator because of the extreme nature of the Boger Swing. But nonetheless, okay, it was an excess, but it was acting very much within the spirit of the camp, and he was never called to account for it.
And he does just look like he actually looks like an ordinary old man, doesn't he? Like you wouldn't. He doesn't have those malicious features that maybe some of the other ones do. But what he did is just beyond words. So I want to touch on a couple of people, but not in any great depth. So this was Bednarek. Now, just a few interesting things about him. So he was a Polish person that was arrested for apparently being a member of the Polish resistance, and he was taken to Auschwitz, and he became a block elder, so a prisoner that had special privileges. Now, he was there from July 1940 until the camp was dissolved in 1945. So he was in Auschwitz for 5 years, if you can believe that. And he began doing the most heinous things you can possibly imagine. There was many witnesses. All in all, he's accused by the prosecution witnesses of 19 separate accounts of murder. So what Dr. Klaczynski, who I spoke about earlier, the Polish lung specialist, says that this guy killed hundreds of people, like arbitrarily killed hundreds. And there's accounts of him on Christmas Eve accusing people of stealing bread and then making up a mock court and saying that he needed to do the justice himself, and taking a stick from the food bucket and beating this person to death with it, nearly to death with it. And then when they were on the floor, he put the stick on their neck and stood on both sides of it and broke their neck, which is something I've heard about several different guards in Auschwitz doing. Another account of what he did was that he used to like gymnastics and so-called sport as well, so torture positions. He would regularly force students into these positions. And then a witness called Schwarzbaum, who lived in Israel before the trial, testified that he got one witness to punch the other in the face, fallaciously saying, "Oh, he's called your mother a whore, now punch him in the face." And then this prisoner didn't react for a while, so Bednarek started hitting him, and then he forced a fight between these two individuals, and then as they were fighting, he then jumped in and beat them both to death. It just goes on and on, the most sadistic cruelty that you can possibly imagine, and it was really quite disturbing to hear about this guy's antics. And these were two of the defense counsels that I thought was interesting. So this guy is Hans Latnesser, and this is his like junior attorney or something, or what would junior partner maybe in the law firm. And Hans Latnesser,
you'd say associate.
Yeah. So Hans Latnesser was quite famous in Germany. He had defended Nazis at the International Military Tribunal. He'd represented Nazis at the Farben case, and also he'd worked for Mengelé's family. So there was no case that this guy would not take in terms of dreadful Nazi perpetrators. And I think he was Capesius he was defending, but also other Nazis. And Fritz Steinacker, he was a Nazi, and he had worked in bombing. He'd served in bomber command during World War II. And when reading these people's, or Hans Lattner's defense, it was really, really interesting because he is basically an evil genius. It was quite disturbing how impressive he was. He knows his law, and he knows his stuff, and I think that makes him all the more terrifying. He's often, when you're looking at films or fictions, like if you think about 1984 and O'Brien, it's those highly competent villains that are the most terrifying. And he certainly, when I was reading his arguments, he certainly qualifies as one of them. And one of the main things that he would do was he would play on the Cold War situation of the time. Lots of these witnesses had come from the Soviet Union or East Germany, and he would just say, and this is 1963, so with the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961, Cold War tension, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Cold War tensions are peaking at this point. So he would just say to them, the ones that are affiliated or can be affiliated with communism, he would just say to them, so are you a communist party? Are you in the Communist Party? And this would cause a massive furore in court, but you can see what he's doing. He's trying to discredit. He's doing his job, I suppose.
He's doing his job. Yeah,
He's trying, yeah, and you could see that this would be quite an effective tactic. There was apparently one witness called Markovich, and Lattner says, I asked him whether, as a member of the Soviet zone governor, he had taken part in the decision to build the wall. Obviously, nothing to do with the crimes in Auschwitz, but he's deflecting the attention away from the crimes and onto the actions of the witnesses. And he said that the witness behaved terribly when I made a request to arrest him as a participant in the order to shoot at the Berlin Wall. So that's like one of his main focuses in trying to discredit these witnesses, and you can see he does it again and again and again. And then he says, he appeals. He says, I asked you, High Court, to have some modesty when assessing the defendant's situation, and also to be aware that you yourself could be affected if fate had wanted it that way. Because if you approach the examination of things with such modesty and the awareness that just mentioned, then you can very well express the opinion that these defendants also became victims of Hitler. So there's that victim.
There's the narrative.
There's the victim narrative. Yep, they're not perpetrators. They are victims themselves, because the Nazi system kind of swooped down upon them and forced them to behave in this manner. There was no personal agency of themselves. They were just following orders. And it says, finally, it says, because it was on his orders that Auschwitz was built, and it is on, he's talking about Hitler, and it was on his orders that these defendants came to Auschwitz without wanting to themselves. And that's pretty standard defense, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that and superior orders. Befehlsnos no stand.
So let's finish by having a look at what happened to these perpetrators. So we've got, let's just have a little bit of a look at the sentences. Fritz Bauer considered this to be a complete failure, this, not just because of the sentences, but I think he probably knew that this was coming, but because of the way that the perpetrators, he said, were portrayed in the media as kind of deranged lunatics, and it was the opposite of what we've been talking about, the ordinary man thesis. These were supposed to be like especially evil human beings, and normal people wouldn't behave in this way. And Fritz Bauer didn't like that, because that wasn't what he saw. So we've got 8 years, 9 years. Capesius gets 9 years. I'm pretty sure he gets out in 1968, so he gets out after 3 years, and he's got successful businesses. Lattner and Steinacker were defending him, and apparently Capesius had buckets of money, some of which he'd stolen, and some of which he had from businesses that he owned. So he was I'm sure that they played a role in getting him out in 3 years as well. And he just went back to, he was given back his druggist license and just continued on as normal. You get life imprisonment, head of protective custody at the camp. We have Boger here, life and 5 years imprisonment.
Jonny, you said
Yeah.
Capesius was able to resume his career as a pharmacist?
Yep. So he got his druggist license. He was arrested by the British and the Americans after the war in 1948, and then nothing really came of it. He was again past his denazification. Maybe I think he lied on his denazification certificate as to exactly what role he'd played, and then he just went on practicing, built up successful businesses, went into this trial, and then was released after 3 years as well. He was acquitted after 3 years.
Was he able to continue as a pharmacist after his?
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
So this reminds me of Hertha Oberhäuser, right? Who was convicted in the doctor's trial by the Americans, and she was eventually released as a part of the wave of amnesties in the 1950s. And she was able to resume her medical practice. She had been a Nazi doctor working in concentration camps. And she was able to resume her medical practice. And eventually there was a public outcry, and the state then where she was living moved to revoke her license. But
really
similar sort of situation, right?
Yeah, similar. And if you compare these to the trials that were going on in Poland, it's really his pittance that's being dished out here, isn't it, to these perpetrators? And we can, as we said, it was because of that fundamental difference in the legislation and the legal systems that they were being tried with.
Yeah, and that's really the principal kind of legacy, I think, of the Auschwitz trial seems to hinge upon that question of how effective it was as an instrument of justice. And as you've suggested, I mean, there's serious question as to whether the trial achieved its purposes of punishing these perpetrators of mass murder and genocide and cruelty and torture. Was it an adequate vehicle for punishing these crimes? A lot of scholars who've looked at this do not believe that it was.
And one thing that I thought was just so interesting, and this is be a good point to finish on, and I hadn't realized, is that this Auschwitz trial was taking place at the same time as the other trials that we're going to talk about. Is taking place at the same time as the Treblinka trial. And if you think about these two places, Auschwitz and Treblinka, the two in terms of the history that I've learned, the two most heinous and diabolical places that human beings have ever created.
Sure.
And we have these two trials going on at the same time.
Try Kelmno sometime.
Yeah.
Which I'm working on currently. It's an order of evil, a magnitude of evil. I mean, how can you surpass Auschwitz and Treblinka? I don't know, but Kelmno is as bad in its own way.
So next time we come together to talk, let's we're gonna finally, because we weren't gonna originally we were just gonna jump straight in at the Belzec trial, weren't we?
Yeah, that's what we talked about doing. Yeah.
But then I felt we needed to set the stage with the Ulm and the Frankfurt trials, and then next time we speak, we'll jump in at the Belzec trial then.
Good. Hopefully it's becoming clear based upon this podcast and also the earlier one that these trials take place in West Germany. They're really subjected to German law. They're not applying, international law. They're not applying the kinds of precedents and legal reasoning that emerges during the Nuremberg war crimes trials of the 1940s.
Yeah.
I mean, the Poles were doing that. The Poles were actually, because their proceedings were taking place at the same time as the IMT, they were actually trying to incorporate principles of law from the IMT as it was taking place. You do not find that with the German trials at all. They're based entirely upon the German criminal code and its definition of homicide. And that's just a garment that oftentimes does not fit the body of the crimes that had been committed. and it leads to really strange outcomes that people continue to puzzle over and to deplore, like with the Auschwitz trial, with reduced sentences and acquittals, and people being released from prison after short periods of time. And a lot of that is being driven by a legal system that really was not equipped at its most fundamental level to deal with the kinds of crimes committed during the final solution.
Yeah. So next time, Belzec, and I did want to talk about Rudolf Werber, but we just didn't have time. So maybe in the future, somewhere down the line, I think he deserves his own podcast. I didn't want to rush it with him because it's such an incredible story. Down the line somewhere, we'll do a Werber podcast by himself. But next time, Belzec, then.
Sounds great. Yeah, I was hoping we'd get to Hans Buchan too. I didn't have a chance to talk much about him, but perhaps when we talk about Treblinka, we'll come back and talk a bit about Buchan, because he testified both at the Auschwitz trial and the Treblinka trial.
Oh, perfect then. Yeah, that's great. He works there. Oh, that works. Okay then. Right. See you next time for Belzec.
It's a great pleasure being with you. Take care.
You too, Michael.